Welcome to the Contrarians, and tonight we have a special episode. We are going to take a look at Black Sabbath, and we're going to take a look at the blues. The combination, how much blues is in Black Sabbath? The panel's here. We are ready. Let's get this started. Welcome to the Contrarians and to just a general discussion. Normally we do like a theme episode, but tonight we're looking at just a basic question. Is there blues in Black Sabbath? This whole topic, we did a pub rock show that just aired last week. So that's where the genesis of this idea came from. But we're going to throw it over to Martin, who came up with the thesis for this show. And we'll let him just start it off, and we'll just go around and talk to Davy and Peter Kerr and just get their thoughts on the whole, is there blues in Black Sabbath? So I want to welcome everybody here tonight. I want to welcome everybody who's watching the show. If you'd like to be on these shows, you could be on these shows as well. We have a Patreon, a Ko-fi, buy us a pint or a cup of coffee. And we also like donos. Feel free to help us out any way we can so we can produce more content for you. So let's just get started. I'm going to throw over to Martin. And let's get started. All right, thanks.
Yeah, so I think we're calling this how much blues is in Black Sabbath, right? So the idea is that, I'm even going to concede that there is some blues in Black Sabbath, but I'm the guy who's always railing up and down that heavy metal gets invented when the blues gets excised out of this rock and roll music, this heavy, loud music, or whatever you want to call it, that was coming out of the 60s sort of thing. So this whole question arose because, invariably, if you're going to talk about pub rock, you're going to end up talking about the blues, the blues, how it bisects and trisects with punk and all that sort of stuff. And then we got kind of off topic a little bit. We started railing on about, is Motorhead a heavy metal band, and how much blues is in Black Sabbath. And we thought, hey, there's two shows there, and we're probably going to make it into two shows, but this is the first one. So yeah, I've always, I did this book long time ago. This is 120,000 words that ends in 1971. And it's that whole question is really sort of handled over here, like beat over the head. And my whole thesis about heavy metal is invented with the first Black Sabbath album, with Uriah Heep, Very Heavy, Very Humble, with Deep Purple in Rock, and then with another Black Sabbath album in 1970, Paranoid. So those four records, and then we have dribs and drabs and little traces of things before that go into it. So yeah, well, you know what? We'll make this a bit of a round table, and I'm not gonna go too much into it. I'll make my points after we hear from these guys a little bit, but I'm just gonna start with the premise that where I'm gonna be sort of arguing from in this how much blues is in Black Sabbath. I'm gonna be saying almost none, and it's something that we shouldn't be celebrating, even if there is any blues in Black Sabbath, because I think the point is we're all talking about Black Sabbath, and they're super famous, because I personally don't think there is much blues in Black Sabbath. I will leave it there. Let's move on to Peter. Take the floor.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. All righty. Well, I think there is blues in Black Sabbath, and I'm not really one for putting things to a mathematical equation as to how much and percentages, but I've been doing a lot of listening to Black Sabbath, and my equation is, I think, about 33.33% of the Aussie era is blues. So you've got the original incarnation of Black Sabbath, which was Earth. And they were very influenced by John Mayall's Blues Breakers, Cream, 10 years after. And that first album with Black Sabbath, the debut, there is a lot of blues instrumentation, and especially Ozzy's vocal lines. So the ones that I'd like to spotlight, you've got The Warning, The Wizard. It's got that guitar riff, it's got the harmonica, and Ozzy's vocals and Wicked World. They're the three that I'll spotlight for the first album. Now, Martin on the Pub Rock show said, oh, okay, what about Paranoid? There's absolutely no blues in Paranoid, Masters Reality Volume 4, etc., etc. Well, I counterpoint that. I think there is blues, but the blues is in Ozzy's vocals. Ozzy is a very unusual singer, and his vocal melodies are bluesy. You might have all that heavy instrumentation underpinning it, which is the down tuning, the sludgy guitar work, the chords, but it's actually Ozzy's vocals that is the hook and the line above the melody that makes up the blues. And it's all the way, well, the majority of the way through the first mark of Black Sabbath. So you listen to War Pigs, for example. Now, War Pigs has all the blues incarnations that you would expect for a blues singer. It's got that sort of the pitching. You've got the phrasing. It's got what you call slurring, where it's going up an octave and it's coming down. Ozzy is basically doing a vocal line that doesn't match the guitar line. And that's where a lot of the bluesiness of the vocal lines are, because it doesn't follow the guitar line. It doesn't follow the riffage. Ozzy is going off his own tangent and he's doing this bluesy sort of riff lines. So a definition of bluesy vocals, it's the pitching, it's the phrasing, it's the changing of the color of his voice. He does that in a couple of the songs in the first Black Sabbath album, where he actually changes the color and the character of his voice. It's not the Ozzy that you know later in his solo career. It's all the way through. Tomorrow's Dream of Volume 4, I can hear it. Supernaut, Snowblind, I can hear. Even Technical Ecstasy, Rock and Roll Doctor. It's the vocal line. It's not abstract. It's front and center. It's the vocal line that has the bluesy element of Black Sabbath. So I think it's part of their DNA. They originally formed as a bit of a blues band. They metamorphosed into something heavier and down-tuned and sludgy, created heavy metal, but they're still bluesy. And the heart of that blues is Ozzy. And one thing I want to point out is I did a little bit of research. There are so many blues crossover acts that have covered Black Sabbath. Check out on YouTube and type in War Pigs, and there's all these soul singers and black singers that are covering War Pigs because of the melody line. They're not doing their own vocal interpretation. They're following the Ozzy vocal line. It's bluesy. So as for the later Sabbath, Dio, no blues. He's neoclassical, so he excised the blues out of that completely. Gillan, no blues in that. Glenn Hughes, there was a little bit. Heart Like a Wheel, there was definitely some blue inflectations in his vocals. Tony Martin, no blues whatsoever. But that early Ozzy, it's the vocals, and that's where the heart of the blues. Now, you'll have all these naysayers that go, oh, the blues has rules and there's melodies and you've got to follow scales. I tell you what, Muddy Waters and all those cats, they didn't follow rules. They made the rules. And if it sounds like blues to me, it is blues. So 33.33% of that early Black Sabbath is blues, and it's Ozzy Osbourne. He's the heart of it.
Wow.
Nice.
Wow. Excellent. Wow, I don't even know what to say. Wonderful, Peter. Well, let's throw it over to Davy and see what Davy's take is on this.
Well, good evening, everybody.
All right, Davy.
Hello. I'm glad we changed the title to How Much rather than Is There, because that could be a rather short episode with one word answer, really. Because even as Martin conceded, yes, there is. It's really degrees. Whether you think it's very little or an absolutely massive amount, it's somewhere in the middle, let's be honest. I think you have to ignore the first album to go with Martin's thesis that there's very little at all. With that first album in play, Yeah, there's blues. There just is. It's all over that first record, and we know stuff that happened before then. They didn't come out of nothing. We know it's been well documented. I think Martin's probably written a good few thousand words on it over the piece in 1,000 different articles and books. I mean, we know they changed their name because there was already a band called Earth. They see the Mario Bava picture and decide that sounds good title, and they adopt Black Sabbath, which curiously enough, it sounds like a sinister name, but Black Sabbath's a very meta film, which ends with a reveal that it's all just a show. Boris Karloff is riding a fake horse in a movie studio by himself, so it kind of pulls back the curtain to say it's just an act, folk, a bit like Black Sabbath themselves. No, we're not really evil. There's a kind of meta quality to that as well, almost accidentally. But going back even to 1969, so when they were recording the album, or even before, we do have an early song from them like The Rebel, which is a pure blues. The earliest known bootleg of them live is from Scotland. It's from Dumfries. They soon became rather too big to play Dumfries. 9 men and a dog, I think, is the usual attendance for a gig in Dumfries. But on that gig, the 2 covers they did that night were Let Me Love You Baby by Buddy Guy and Early One Morning Blues by Elmore James. That's not just blues, that's a very specific era of blues as well. So they're doing, just before that first album, they're doing some real Chicago blues stuff. And obviously Tony, what band does he briefly join? Jethro Tull, right at the peak of their blues era, before they become the Jethro Tull that we know and love, really. We've got books from the members, and to a man they all say, yeah, we were blues, or we were blues rock. I think Ozzy's one, I went back and checked, he says dark blues jazz. The jazzy thing, I think, comes from a more improvisational tendency that the band had. I don't particularly hear, or some free notation from them, but I don't think you would identify it as jazz if not for just the improv nature of it. Geezer's just got a book out, which is wonderful, and he calls it a blues album that went heavy while they were making it, which I think that works too. He says also, interestingly, they were going to do another album after 13, which was going to be a straight blues album. They wanted to bring it full circle. It doesn't specifically say full circle to the first album. I think he really means full circle to their early sounds and early influences. I'm kind of glad that didn't happen. That seems a bit novelty to me to kind of do that. It may as well be Deep Purple's bloody covers record from the pandemic, which everybody's forgotten, probably for the best, to be honest. So they all, to varying extents, call it blues. Tony never shuts up every time he's interviewed. He's on record as being a massive fan of Hank Marvin and whatnot. He's obviously not blues. But his blues favourite was Eric Clapton. After not liking Clapton for a while, he did fall in love with Eric Clapton and then started investigating the works that inspired Eric Clapton once he really got into them. Obviously, that first record, we've got the seminal title track with the famous inverted tritone, whatever you want to call it. It's got a million names in music. But that's used in all sorts of blues music. It's a blues scale. So it's used, as we know, to depict, in shorthand musically, evil, ominous, darkness. That's how it's used. A bit like the same way that bubblegum pop and country music use the same scales. It's exactly the same kind of thing. It doesn't make it blues, but it's certainly bluesy. And that why is quite important in the discussion, I think, where it's not blues, you're not going to mistake it for Howlin' Wolf. You're not going to mistake it for Little Walter. You're certainly not going to mistake Ozzy's harmonica playing for Little Walter anytime soon, but it's there. And then the last minute or so of that title track, even where the pace really picks up, Tony's doing a pure blues solo. It would not be out of place on the Derek and the Dominoes album, if Clapton or Duane Allman whipped that out. It wouldn't be a place on an Allman's record, actually, at last minute. And really, that's where a lot of the bluesy parts come from me. So I'm glad Peter highlighted the vocals in particular, because to me, it's in Tony Iommi's solos, it's in his licks. That's where you can find a lot more of the blues. And I know in the last episode, Martin did say you can if you ignore those, but to ignore the quite lengthy solos in some of these pieces is to cut a massive chunk out for no real reason. So I wouldn't do that. They're there, so we have to consider them, I think. It's kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. But it's interesting, too, that Black Sabbath did create that new sound, partially because Tony had to come up with something because of his accident with his fingers. So some of it was by default, some of it was by design. As we know, the sound was changing anyway, so they had to come up with something that wasn't just blues boom, because that was on the way out anyway. But yeah, as Peter highlighted a few tracks, The Wizard's pure blues. Ozzy's not just playing harmonica, he's playing cross harp, which is pure blues. It's not harmonica, it's a two-note cross harp where you're playing in a different note from everybody else to make it stand out more. NIB's full of blues riff, and Sleeping Village has got a Jews harp straight from Canned Heat's Living the Blues record. That's the only other rock record I can think of that's got that. Well, the band have it, but not in a even remotely blues setting in that one. Warning, as we know, although Bill's drumming, I think, is not bluesy at all. I think he's doing much more. That probably is where you could say there's a little bit of jazz coming in. But Tony and Ozzy are certainly playing it very bluesy. There's it's obviously an Ainsley Dunbar cover, which, again, I think previously Martin had said if you ignore that as well, but it's on the record, so I don't really see why it would be ignored. Wicked Worlds has the kind of call and response thing that's very blues, which you get in the likes of Rolling and Tumbling, a classic blues kind of thing. They did a John Peel session in April 1970, so after the record came out, and they're playing it even bluesy on the record. You can listen to it on YouTube, it's phenomenal stuff, but they're playing it even bluesier than anything on here. It's easy to focus on the debut, and that if we take the debut out of the equation, I think there's much more of an argument in Martin's favour. But even after that, as Peter said, there's Fairies Wear Boots, which, okay, is not far removed from the debut, is it? But even in 1974, they're playing live Sometimes I'm Happy, which is a pure blues, and that's reworked into the end section of Symptom of the Universe. So they would often play that kind of thing live and then refine it in the studio. Less obvious as you go on, certainly with Ronnie. I know some people say things like Lonely is the words, has got bluesy elements. I think that's a bit lazy, and just thinking that anything that's kind of desolate and lonesome has that kind of thing. Maybe lyrically. But again, Ronnie's in a different strategy. I think his personality pushes them to come up with something different again. I had Heart Like a Wheel would be my prime example from the Glenn Hughes era. That's not even bluesy, that is pure blues for me. But right up to their last album, 13, you've got Damaged Soul. If Robin Trower had that on a record, no one would think twice if someone called it blues. And just the general aesthetic of Black Sabbath, the whole darkness and the imagery they like to invoke, it goes right back to Robert Johnson, Deals at the Crossroads. You could see them making a deal out of that kind of thing and having that on the Sabbath records. Me and the Devil Blues. From Robert Johnson, having a conversation with Satan coming to your door and walking side by side with him, going down the road feeling bad. It's very much a Black Sabbath thing. So I can see the lyrical crossover too. So I think it's all over the place. But to kind of play devil's advocate against my own thesis, it does fall away. It absolutely does start to fall away. Not so much in the solo, and there's always a bit of that because you can't just rewrite your DNA. But I think they start to realize, well, we're Black Sabbath. So they start to know what a Black Sabbath record can be. So they start to make that. So what does a Black Sabbath record sound like? What do people like in a Black Sabbath record? frankly, I'd use Judas Priest as a more apt example of what happens when you take the blues out from the outset. I think they're more of an accurate case to use this idea for. But yeah, I'll leave it there since we're doing a bit of roundtable.
Wow. Excellent. Thanks, Davy. Well, Martin, what do you think? You've heard both of these gentlemen.
Okay. I love that. Great information, really cool stuff. I learned a lot of things, but so here's my problem. So I guess I'm looking at blues a little bit more literally and much closer to the blues bone. Like, let's take The Warning, for example. Number one, they didn't write it. Number two, this is one of the bigger arguments for them being blues. You mentioned lonely is the word. And you say, it's a bit lazy calling it that because it's like desolate and lonely and stuff. I feel like the reasons we might look at that and call it bluesy can basically be applied to all these other songs as well. The Warning isn't a blues. NIB, I'm hearing almost no blues. I'm really hearing the invention of heavy metal in that. The song Black Sabbath, I'm hearing no blues. Now, I love Peter's argument about, and Davies about the guitar and Peter's about the vocals. So my point is you're not hearing, a 12-bar blues itself. You're not hearing 12/8 time or 3/4 time, or you're not hearing a 1/4/5 blues. So we're finding bluesy elements in these things, and that's fine. But I basically think you're literally finding music in here. So here's something interesting. So I was on John Gaffney's show this morning, Lair of the Alchemist. Excellent YouTube channel. And we got into this discussion a little bit because we were talking about Led Zeppelin. So I had this out, and I'll get to this in a second. But one thing he said that I thought was interesting is, well, a couple things. So first he said, Tony, when he does solo, he's part of a pentatonic, blues scale kind of thing, and he doesn't really get out of that. And he started explaining, because he's a musician as well. He says, guys like Uli John Roth and Michael Schenker and Yngwie Malmsteen, it's like a full minor scale, Aeolian scale sort of thing, Phrygian scale. So that's where you get that European classical thing. Now, okay, so fine. Tony doesn't go there when he solos. And yes, if you listen to a bunch of his solos, you can imagine them on blues songs, and they come from a blues world and all that, right? But I think basically, again, I guess the main premise is Black Sabbath just moves away from basically anything to do with the blues when it comes to the 80% of the package, which is the song structure of what we're getting, the drum beats, all that, although they will shuffle, but it doesn't sound like a blues shuffle. The other interesting thing John said, I thought was interesting. He says, if they come from a blues end of thing, it's more from the jazzy swinging blues end of thing. End of it. So it's like you can listen to Swing in the Chain or Breakout. You can hear them do jazzy sorts of things. And one thing you guys brought up where I actually feel that there is a little bit of a bluesiness as well. But again, these things are just brief flashes of stuff that come from their past, but the mellow part of Symptom of the Universe as well, right? And yes, I've always mentioned that the closest thing, what I always say is the closest thing Sabbath ever got to the blues, a blues, okay, again, I'm being literal here, a blues is Rock and Roll Doctor, right? Which is a boogie, barrel house boogie type song, and boogie is just one form of the blues sort of thing, right? So the funny thing is when we were talking about this album, so, illustrative of this whole thing, it's got You Shook Me on it and I Can't Quit You Baby, which are straight blues. But then they take that extra step and you've got How Many More Times and Dazed and Confused, right? So the funny point about this whole argument about calling certain Black Sabbath songs, even on the first album, let's use Warning for an example, or Wicked World too. Actually, I can understand the blues structure that you're finding. But the funny thing that I find amusing is that if blues artists did those songs, you were saying they were being heavy metal or hard rock or being something other than the blues. It's way at the edge of what they do, So with Sabbath, you have to drag it over and toss it into the blues that way. Another argument I want to make is that, just because Status Quo and Golden Earring started as pop psych bands doesn't mean there's psych and pop in their music later on, on 10 or 12 records sort of thing. And same with Black Sabbath. Just because they started as a blues band doesn't mean there's blues in what they do later. But there are all these avenue type things, and which I find abstract discussions more about just musical things that happen, like Ozzy's vocals. To find blues in it, to say Black Sabbath has blues because of Ozzy's vocals, I don't get anywhere near 33 1/3 because of that. I'm just thinking that's just a guy singing, right? And a guy singing can kind of come from all sorts of things. So again, I find like when we even get as close as we can possibly get to calling Black Sabbath bluesy, we're just talking about dark ballads, balladic, doomy, dirgy, mellow music, right? Or when they're jammy, so Tony can solo, and so he solos, and it sounds a little bit bluesy in the solo. I personally don't care. What I think is that they aren't doing a blues. They aren't doing the 3 or 4 things that are of the rule book that call something a blues. And I think it's just far enough removed that I want to give them credit for inventing heavy metal. And again, my whole premise, I look at Deep Purple and Rock, I look at Uriah Heep, Very Heavy, Very Humble, and Paranoid, and Master of Reality, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, all these records. I think they draw more from this interesting doomy classical thing than they do from the blues, and that's where your ears prick up and say, oh, they're inventing something brand new, and this heavy metal is basically nothing like the blues. I think I've covered just a couple things in my notes here that you think of Reefer Head Woman by Aerosmith on Night of the Ruts. Interestingly, I checked again. I remember we talked about that album, and Wiki says it's a Skip Gillum cover, and my actual copy of that album just says it's written by Aerosmith, right? But I imagine it is a cover. I didn't look it up, but you listen to that, and that is a blues. That's why we call Heart Like a Wheel a blues song. That's why we can call Reefer Head Woman a blues song. I can't think of a single song, even on the debut, that I would call a blues. That's my problem with it, right? And then as Davy says, you fall away from that, and you really got to scrounge around for it. You have to look in one tone, like Ozzy's vocal, or you have to look at, oh, Tony's coming up and soloing. There's 3 other guys doing stuff when Tony's soloing. They're not necessarily bluesy, but sure, Tony solo, okay, it could be a blues solo. And the last thing I want to mention is Davey mentioned the aesthetic. Oh, the aesthetic comes right out of the blues. Again, it's the same thing. When the blues people are being super, super dark, it's a bit of an outlier. I don't think being super, super dark is the blues. I think it's basically an outlier thing. And then Sabbath will come an outlier with them, and there'll be that little bisecting of the circles at that point. But no, so that's kind of my point. I'm really, I guess, a little more literal about it. I want to hear if I'm going to say Black Sabbath has blues in it, I want to hear them doing a blues or a boogie. And they almost never, ever do that. I don't even think they really do it on the debut.
Well, I guess that's the difference. I don't need them to be singing "Woke Up This Morning," and literally having the. I don't need that to call something bluesy. So it doesn't need to follow those rigid structures. It can be more abstract. And we're talking weeks before the first album they were played blues, so it's not 12 albums beforehand or anything. So it's very much straight into album 1, but there is definitely a conscious effort to do something plus. So they're not making a blues. I 100% would agree with that. They are not at any point into the studio saying let's make a blues record. Every step
they don't even play a blues song.
No,
but
and
the influences come out. That's the whole thing.
but exactly,
There's blues influences. This whole thing about they created heavy metal, I grant you that. But Martin, did this whole thesis about them creating heavy metal, did that come out in 69 or 70? Or did this come like 10 years later in 1980, where people look back and go, oh, Black Sabbath created heavy metal? I would imagine that Black Sabbath in that era, and I'm not an expert in all the festivals they played, but they could have easily slotted in any blues fest with their sound sonically. And I think a lot of people that love the blues would have grooved to Black Sabbath in 1969 and 70 because it was in that wheelhouse.
You know why, Peter? Because everybody loves heavy metal, but they just don't know it. So they'd be hearing something that would be super exciting them, because heavy metal is really cool and exciting. They would probably all move over to Black Sabbath. But I mean, they would certainly sound much heavier and louder and more up tempo than a blues band, right? You know, you think of even NIB or the fast part of Black Sabbath, and then for, you know, you think of Paranoid, you think of you know, some super heavy stuff in there, Iron Man. So again, I just feel like anytime Black Sabbath does anything that you could even call remotely bluesy on a large structural sense, if a blues band did that, you would say they were doing something different from the blues.
No, I think it's in the similar wheelhouse. Now, getting back to the topic of blues is not happy clappy. Now, the traditional blues is like Muddy Waters and, you know, The Lady Did Me Wrong, all that sort of thing, really emotional sort of subject matter. Black Sabbath substitute the traditional topics of blues for world destruction, topics about politics, religion, the way that the world is just stuffed up. So they're substituting melancholy, sadness topic for something else, the traditional for the new. So I still think it falls into that that subject matter of blues. It's just that they're talking about something else. It doesn't have to be traditional, you know, blues subject matter. And that's my interpretation of the blues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know, back to this Led Zeppelin album. I mean, I think the reason this band got famous is more because of How Many More Times and Dazed and Confused rather than the blues songs. So again, I think those two songs are like gateway songs to the first Black Sabbath album. And then Good Times, Bad Times and Communication Breakdown are even more so direct gateways to heavy metal on this record, right? And then when they get to Whole Lot of Love, they're essentially they've almost masked a blues riff so much in, you know, palm muted disciplined guitar playing, you know, almost like thrash mechanical style to that, because you listen to the riff basically a cappella to begin with, right? That they are truly inventing heavy metal at that point. So I think in Led Zeppelin you can see a lot of this argument, but again, when you listen to After Forever, Sweet Leaf, Children of the Grave, Into the Void, you know, that entire album, everything heavy on that, I'm just not hearing like a lick of blues in there. I'm just hearing just bulldozing brand new kind of music.
Literally, it's the vocals. And I was listening to Muddy Waters, and then I put on Black Sabbath first couple of albums, and seriously, I could imagine Muddy Waters singing War Pigs. I could imagine Muddy Waters singing Children of the Grave. You may laugh, Martin, but I'm serious.
No, I'm agreeing with you.
Why not? Why not?
I think he could.
Yeah.
He could.
The whole time you were saying all that, I'm listening to Ozzy's vocals in my head of everything you're mentioning, and I'm totally agreeing with you.
Yeah, again, I'm coming much more from Tony's side in terms of the sound. I hear Tony's parts as being much more. I guess because in part he's there more, because obviously Ozzy's only there when he's doing vocals and harmonica, whereas Tony's there throughout the track. So all the solos are somewhat informed by the blues on that first record, pretty much. He can't play a line without going into the blues. All his licks are bluesy. every single one of them. It's quite tense on the first. It's almost as if somebody pointed it out to him and he said, "Oh, I better try and cut that down in the next couple of records," because it isn't there on album 3, 4. Well, no, it's diminished. I'll put it that way. It's diminished. It's not gone entirely.
But the whole idea of calling those solos bluesy, I'm almost like, into a linguistic thing where I'm thinking, aren't they just electric guitar? I mean, why do we even have to call them bluesy? I mean, I don't even know what other kinds of solos there are at this time.
Going by that logic, would you put Hank Marvin in just because he plays electric guitar and think it sounded the same? No, of course not. It's a completely different sound. Tony Iommi comes from a different school. He's learned the blues and he knows how to play it. More importantly, he's not learned directly from that first generation of blues. He's learned from the guys that learned from that. So he's copying the white guys. So he's copying the Claptons, he's copying the Peter Greens. That's the sound that he's trying to translate. So he's not copying straight blues, he's copying white boy blues from England. So we're getting second, perhaps even third generation, depending on how you want to interpret it, versions of the blues. It's a very English version by that point of an American style. So I don't think just saying it would be electric guitar does it any credit, because again, if you put your man from Johnny Kidd and the Pirates in there, it's not going to sound the same. He's not a blues player at all, Mick Green. So that wouldn't sound the same. It's masked by a lot of the pedals, a lot of the effects, a lot of Martin Birch's production on the albums. Certainly gives it a different quality, a different cadence. But you can hear it in Tony's playing if you're listening for. Again, it's not to say that it's blues. It's not to say that you're ever going to be listening to this and think, is this the Butterfield Blues Band? Am I listening to Mike Bloomfield all of a sudden? No, you're not going to be thinking that, but you're not going to be a million miles off in that first record. You're not going to be too far away from it.
I'm not there.
How bluesy do you guys think Bill Ward is?
Not massively. I think the rhythm section are more jazz than they are blues.
Mm-hmm.
You can hear that.
I think so too.
It's jazzy, but it's he's closer to a jazz. He's closer to a blues drummer than a rock drummer, to be quite frank. I find him very percussive. He's a very unusual drummer. He's not, comparative to a lot of the drummers for those main hard rock acts. But I think he's closer to a blues drummer by way of being in that jazz realm than a straightforward rock drummer.
But see, here's where it's like, okay, it's interesting to say Bill Ward is close to a jazz drummer, but basically, I think he's like 80% closer to a heavy metal drummer and inventing heavy metal. And yes, he's jazzy at times, and that's interesting about him. But basically, most of the time, he's blasting away at a super heavy 4/4 beat.
And that's been, it's not mutually exclusive. They can create heavy metal and be bluesy at the same time. They can do both, and did both. I think was the rough consensus that we seem to be coming to between me and Peter, certainly. I'll be interested to see the comments and see what people do think. Mm-hmm. But generally speaking, I think we can't take anything away from their achievement. Nobody's looking to diminish that in terms of, they didn't create heavy metal because they were blues. Nobody's coming at it from that thesis. But mostly, I'd say they were informed by where they had been very, very recently, and that pushed them onto somewhere new. It was a new decade. It was time for something new to hit in, and they had, again, by an accident, they had Tony having to completely change the way he did things. He had to start using power chords. He had to start using a completely different technique. He was famously given the record of Django Reinhardt as an inspiration, and don't let it set you back, just come up with something new, and he did. But he, at the same time, didn't throw away everything that he'd learned up until that point, and they weren't throwing away their influences either.
How much blues do you guys think is in Deep Purple in Rock and Machine Head?
Less.
A lot less than
well, Lazy's a very bluesy track. Maybe a little bit less.
No, I'd say
that's more straightforward pyrotechnics.
And also, you can hear more country when it comes to Deep Purple. Again, it doesn't mean they're sitting there doing Hank Williams covers. It's just in the pure licks. It's in the aesthetic, but it's not in the production. It's not in that side of it. It's not in the actual effects that would be added to it. It's not in the pedals that they're using. But certainly,
I reckon there's R&B, because I think Deep Purple actually swings.
Well,
there's a lot of, like, Pacey's a jazzy drummer, and a lot of their music, especially live, it actually has a groove and it swings, and you're a bit more on the R&B, rhythm and blues. But straightforward blues may be lazy. In rock was just straightforward. That was just straight meat and potatoes, pyrotechnics, hard rock.
Yeah.
I can hear a little jammy quality in Living Wreck, and I can hear a little bit of the call and response, the kind of Aussie vocal structuring in Speed King, even though it's it's an absolute modern heavy metal classic. And then, both bands do the shuffle sometimes, right? Shuffle is kind of a blues trait. But I figure Sabbath basically perfected the heavy metal shuffle.
I would love to know what the difference would be in a couple of alternate universes. Sabbath get a record deal in '68. If they'd been going earlier, what would that have been like? And Sabbath have a keyboard player instead of Deep Purple. What would those two lineups have been like then? Because you add John Lord into the equation, you are going to be adding much more of a classical aesthetic rather than, Big Bill Brunsey wasn't sitting with John Lord next to him, was he? Let's be honest, when it comes to playing the blues. But yeah, every other track could be a little bit more bluesy with Deep Purple, but then they would go into something that's not even remotely blues, which would usually be led by some majestic John Lord stuff that would just take you into another realm altogether.
What about Mark III Deep Purple? Wow. That goes down,
and certainly 4. You start to get much more into the R&B. We know that was
R&B, funk, definitely.
That was almost a fait accompli by Ritchie to kind of do that. That wasn't even. I don't think we're even just observing that. I think that's Ritchie putting. I think that's much more. Glenn Hughes, you just don't have him in a band without some of that coming through. Sometimes rather gratingly in live versions once they. Took hold of them, unfortunately, but and Tommy Bolin gives you a different aesthetic again, and to the extent that they put off Ritchie Blackmore, so they transmogrified into something completely different by then. But such was the time, I guess, that you could completely change sound completely within a couple of years. And
I'd be really interested for the comments of this show for people that actually went to Black Sabbath in the day. I'm talking about 69 and 70. And what did you think when you saw Black Sabbath? Did you hear any blues? Did you hear any blues in it?
What was Black Sabbath considered when they hit?
I can tell you some of those answers. Progressive rock, acid rock,
acid rock, I could see that.
Stoner rock.
Blues rock, probably blues.
I think stoner rock came later.
And then Bill Ward's funny description, Wine and Reds band, right? Tranquilizers and red and wine, like just to make you as downer as, falling asleep as possible, right? But yeah, and that whole Vertigo stable was considered kind of like progressive rock, but then people would say it's the harder end of progressive rock. But yeah, they used underground rock. That's another one that they were called back.
Yeah, because think about them coming on the scene. That would be very underground. That, think about it. No one else was doing that. That's like alternative music back in the day.
They were quite famous immediately. And again, I think it's the power of heavy metal. It's like people heard that and go, wow, this is brand new and we love it. So they made a splash immediately. And the whole thing I said in the last episode about Jim Simpson, basically everybody was getting impatient with the British blues boom, and then Sabbath kind of like, walks out of it the same time Jim wants to stop booking these bands at his club in Birmingham, because he's getting impatient and bored with it too, and so is Sabbath, and I think it's to their credit that they left it right behind, and I still will maintain that they didn't do a blues ever again. I mean, really ever again. I mean, even Rock and Roll Doctor is a boogie, and Heart Like a Wheel is just like a doomy, it's barely even a blues.
Which is interesting, because we have come at it from different perspectives. As you say, you've come at it from a much more literal point of view, but the question being asked being how much blues is in Black Sabbath didn't translate to me as meaning how many literal blues songs did they perform, which would be a rather different debate. So I took it to be how much is it in the band itself in terms of DNA, in terms of performance, in terms of what they actually put out, what goes into the ear of the listener, the end of it.
Yeah. Well, and the other metaphysical thing about this is, again, back to the point of in their DNA and where did they come from? People move through time, and just because they come from something, I mean, they all came from Puff the Magic Dragon too, in children's records.
Yeah,
right?
Again, but we're talking about months later. We're not talking about years later.
Well, yeah, but months moves into the second album, and it moves into the third album. Now it's 2 years later or whatever. They choose to leave it behind, essentially, is what I think happens.
But that means completely ignoring the first album then, because there's still blues on that. The literal blues song and the Island Bar cover. They were still playing much bluesier sessions with John Peel, so they were not ditching the blues live by that stage. They weren't leaning into whatever they thought their new sound. I'd be interested to read quotes from them at the time, because quite annoyingly they all kind of call it blues of some sort now, but you don't tend to read much from 69, 70 when they were being written about, because we know that they had rather a snooty press from both sides of the Atlantic at the time.
Right.
So they weren't getting the kind of coverage where they were being given in-depth interviews. I'd love to know what they were aiming for, what they thought they were aiming for, what they then thought, wait, that wasn't quite what we were thinking of, but let's roll with that. Because they can't possibly know that themselves now. They've become such different people over more than 50 years. It's quite...
Well, one thing we know they were aiming for was trying to make scary music.
Yes, and again, they wouldn't have come out with the quotes then that they have in their books and things saying we wanted to do hammer horror, but musically. That would have just been passé even at that point to say something like that. It would have been trite novelty act stuff, just sub-Arthur Brown levels.
I was thinking Arthur Brown, yeah.
You wouldn't have been taken seriously if they just said hammer horror, but music. But yeah, you can absolutely hear that aesthetic too. So it's brilliant, because we don't have to decide that this is a good or bad thing. We don't have to decide that it negates any of their heavy metal influence whatsoever, one iota, or one iomi. But it gives us this. That was an awful pun. Excuse me. But
I loved it.
Yeah, so it lets us kind of come at this thing from a slightly more objective point of view, whereas we're looking at it not from do we like this as a thing, just do we hear it as a thing, which is quite different.
And we hear what we hear.
I think that's the perfect segue to lead out of this. We want to hear from you. How much blues is in Black Sabbath? Please leave it in the comment. We'll try to answer them. It's a fascinating topic, and we do want to hear from you. Gentlemen, do you have anything to close with real quick before we wrap this up? I think you've probably done it.
We're just looking forward to the Motorhead episode now.
Motorhead episode. So stay tuned for that.
Oh, I don't know.
All right, Davy Gallagher and Peter Kerr, I want to thank you both for coming on. It's been a lot of fun. We'll see you on the next. Stay tuned. I'm going to try to get this up ASAP. We will have a Motorhead episode soon, so stay tuned for that. Plenty of more great content on the way, so stay tuned, and we'll see you on the next one.